Hello, welcome to Not Half Bad, where I go through tips, tricks and tutorials for crochet. Today I'm going to be going through the top crochet terms to know. I think with any craft there is always a new set of language that you kind of have to learn, and sometimes they're not really explained. So I figured this would be a great beginner video and for my first video of my channel. So the things I'm going to be discussing are more the terminology rather than the actual stitches. So outside of things like single crochet, double crochet, that kind of thing, it's going to be more in-depth specific terms that I used when you are being taught these kind of stitches. This really beautiful yarn is in a really lovely green colour, is from the Wool Factory, and it's called Pearl Sky DK. They are in 100 gram skeins and they are 100% acrylic. This one is colour 8, which is a beautiful kind of plush emerald green. So first up is going to be the yarn weight. Anytime you purchase a skein of yarn, it is going to have a label on it which will specify what weight the yarn is. This one in particular is DK, which is also known as double knit, and it basically just means that there are two strands of fibre kind of spun together, hence double. You can get lots of different sizes, from really thick and chunky weights to more thin and almost thread-like weights. DK is often regarded as a kind of medium size. So those are the things that you're going to be wanting to look for when you're purchasing your yarn. On each yarn label as well, it will always have the care instructions, and it will have the grams of the actual weight, the kind of total weight of the skein, and then the approximate meters or yards. Obviously you've got your wash instructions there, and then you've got more information about the yarn manufacturer. You will also have, depending on if you knit or crochet, you will have a gauge measurement, and you will also have the knitting needle recommendations and the crochet hook size recommendation. So for this skein, it recommends 4mm crochet hook, which is also known as a UK 8. I personally only use crochet hooks that have a millimeter measurement, so that makes it really easy for me, because then I know that this yarn needs a 4mm hook. And just for context, here is a 4mm hook. You can see it is very clearly labelled there. The F is also I believe it's a US measurement, and they sometimes do their hook measurements in letters. This one is a ergonomic grip hook, and I got this from the Wool Factory as well in a multi-pack. And you can see at the top here the size of the hook. So here is the 4mm and the 5mm hook side by side, and you can kind of see the difference in size on the actual hook. They tend to go up in 0.5mm or 0.25mm increments, so you can get hook sizes that are 3.75mm, you can get some that are 3.5, that sort of thing. So it just depends on where you're getting your hooks from. I personally really love these ergonomic grip ones because they are a lot more comfortable for me to hold. And then we have a really small 2mm hook, which is half the size of this one, and you can really see the difference in the hook size there. Here's a little swatch I made out of this really beautiful emerald green yarn. So the next term I'm going to be discussing is yarn over, and that's something that you'll probably hear a lot when you are looking at tutorials for more basic stitches, or the more complex ones. You will hear the term yarn over quite a lot. All that means is that when you have your hook on your stitch, you are going to have the yarn go over the hook. You can do this typically one of two ways. So you can either physically wrap the yarn over the hook like that, and you can see that there's that yarn is now literally over the hook, or you can use or you can use the hook itself to kind of snatch it over, and that has the same effect. You still have this part of the yarn wrapped over the hook. You typically are doing a yarn over for a double crochet or a treble crochet, that sort of thing, and then you would complete your stitch. So that is what yarn over means, and that's a double crochet. So we're going to do it again nice and slow. So we yarn over, and then we're going to do our double crochet. Like so. The next term we're going to be discussing is pull up a loop, which you will also hear in typically stitch tutorials. So going back to what we first learned, we are going to yarn over. So we have the yarn wrapped around the hook. We are then going to insert the stitch. We are going to use the hook to grab this yarn, pull through, and that is pulling up a loop. So that now means that we have that loop now on our hook, and that is pulling up a loop. So we're going to finish our stitch here. All done. Next we are going to be looking at the loop of the stitches itself. So when you have a little swatch like this, you will have individual stitches, and at the top of each stitch there are 2 loops. So you can kind of see it almost looks like a little braid at the top. So to show you with my hook, we have 1 loop here at the front, and then we have 1 loop here at the back. So there's 1 there and 1 there. So if I put my hook through, you can probably see it a little bit better. You have 2 loops in each stitch. Some tutorials and some stitches will call for you to go through just 1 of these loops, and they will usually specify if it's the front loop or if it's the back loop. Most stitches, or most common stitches, you will be going through both loops like that. If you need to go through the back loop, that is always the one further away from you at the back. So the back loop would be this one, and that will give a very specific effect. You can also only have a front loop, which is the one closest to you. So that would be this loop. And you can see that I've not gone through both loops, I've just gone through the front there. So the next term will be the actual stitches themselves. I often find, and especially when I was a beginner, I didn't really know how to count my stitches. Lots of people were talking about counting your stitches, and I didn't know what that meant. So each time that you do a stitch, that is a stitch basically. So each of these little braids at the top, the front and back loops, is a stitch. And the way you can kind of see if you're doing it is by looking at each stitch from the side, or you can look at it from the top. So when you are doing a swatch, or say you're doing something that has a straight edge or the same number of stitches, counting your stitches as you're doing them is really helpful. But you know, people lose count, people might get distracted, and that happens a lot, and you may need to count your stitches after you've done them. So all you're going to do is look at the top, and you can count each individual little braid. So you've got 1 stitch here, you've got 2 there, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12. So that's by looking at the top. So alternatively, you can also look from the side itself, and you can see each little kind of stick here, and then you can see the top of your little braid where the loops are. Each of these is a stitch. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and so on. So that's another way that you can count your stitches. And I always recommend counting stitches to beginners especially, or especially if it's a new stitch or a new pattern that you're doing, because it's really easy to accidentally miss a stitch, or maybe if you're following a tutorial, your edges might get a little bit wonky, they might curve in, that sort of thing. So I definitely recommend counting your stitches if you are learning something new. The next term is going to be rows. So every time you work your stitches, which is obviously, like I said, these little posts here, every time you work a stitch, that is on a new row. And you sometimes, mostly, will need to count your rows if you're following a tutorial or a pattern. So in order to count your rows, you are basically going to be looking at how many lines of stitches you have. So each individual stick here is a stitch, and each line of them is a row. It's quite easy to count your rows, but sometimes you might want to get a row counter, or you can write them down on a little notebook. But here you can see that there's almost like a little gap in between each row. So for this, it's pretty easy to count. Some stitch patterns are a little bit more complex, so it might be a little bit more difficult for you to count the rows. For this one, you can kind of see that there's like a ridge here, and that is one row. So this was my starting row, and then you have another ridge here, so this is the second row, another ridge here, so this is row 3, and then the final row here, number 4. So I've only got 4 rows here, and that's how you would count your rows. Next term will be frogging. I'm not really sure of the origin of the term frogging or to frog. It basically means that you are undoing the work that you've done. You're pulling out the stitches, and people will frog for a variety of reasons. Say they've maybe made a mistake in a pattern, they have done the stitch incorrectly, maybe they've missed a few stitches, or they've done too many rows, something like that. So you can frog for a variety of reasons. Often for me it's because I have not done the correct number of stitches, or I have maybe gone a little bit too excited and done too many rows. All that means is that you are pulling the yarn away, and then you will be undoing those stitches. So you can see I'm just pulling the yarn, and those stitches are now coming undone. Just like that. Super easy, and you shouldn't typically have any issues with frogging unless you are working with a kind of more specialized yarn. There you go. So that row has now been frogged. And the next term will be the term fasten off. So fastening off means that you are finished with your work. And so if I was to have finished with this, and this is my final piece, I can't just leave it like this, because if I pull the yarn, it's going to undo all of my stitches. So you need to be able to fasten off, at least temporarily, to ensure that your stitches don't become frogged by accident. The way to do this is that when you have finished your row, so say I have just finished this stitch, I'm going to reinsert my hook like this, as if I've just finished the stitch. And then to fasten off, all you're going to do is just chain 1 at the end. So we're going to use our hook to yarn over, and we are going to pull it through that loop like that. And you can see that there is that tiny little chain there. And then to fasten off, all you're going to do is cut off your yarn. So you're going to cut off your yarn, and then now it's detached from the actual ball of yarn. And you are going to pull the loop through the chain you've just made. And that is fastening off. You can see here that the tail of yarn is now through that chain. And we're just going to give this a nice tug, not too tight, but just tight enough, and that is called fastening off. So now that means if I give this a pull, my stitches aren't going anywhere, and then that piece is done, so I can move on to whatever I need to. And the next term that we'll be discussing is freehanding. So most of the time when you are crocheting, you will probably be following a pattern of some kind, whether it's for a wearable garment, maybe an amigurumi, or anything that you'll be crocheting, a blanket, whatever it is. You typically will follow a pattern by a crochet pattern designer, maybe a YouTube tutorial, that sort of thing. But to freehand something is basically that you have come up with it by yourself. I personally freehand a lot because there are some crochet wearables that I like to make that I haven't found a pattern that I like. Or sometimes I have seen an item in maybe like a high street store or a retail store or something, and I have been inspired to make my own. So I haven't been able to find a pattern for it. So I've just kind of guessed and made my best estimate, and I've made my own version. And that's what freehanding means. So those are my top 10 crochet terms that would be really handy to know as a beginner before you delve into the world of crochet and learning all about stitches and patterns and that sort of thing. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. You can also follow me on TikTok and Instagram, and the links are below in the description. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.